teapot, I want to show how color mapping can be used in lieu of adjusting the intensity multiplier of light. So if I render the scene as is, which was the same setup that I originally had, here's what I get. The same thing that I had before. So you can see a small amount of noise on the ground object, but this can be easily fixed with some higher quality settings. Watch what happens if I decrease the light multiplier tenfold from 200 to 20 and offset that reduction in light with a tenfold increase in color mapping strength from 1 to 10. When I render, I get almost the exact same amount of apparent illumination, but the side effect is a tremendous amount of added noise. And if I go even farther and reduce the light multiplier tenfold again and offset this with another tenfold increase in the color mapping, when I render, you can see that the noise gets even worse. And as a side note, I set up this scene so that I only needed to adjust the dark multiplier. The bright multiplier won't affect the scene because there's nothing bright enough for the bright multiplier to affect. So this is definitely an example of why not to use really high or even really low values for color mapping. Values over 4 or 5 is what I consider high. I don't mean to say you can't use such values. I'm just saying that you should be careful when you use such high values because you're almost certainly going to have to use higher quality settings to achieve the same low level of noise that you would have with higher intensity values for your lights. And there's only 3 things that I can do to improve the noise that I see here. I could increase the light's shadow subdivision setting, I could decrease the QMC noise threshold value, or I could improve the image sampling, all of which would definitely increase render times. I don't have GI in the scene, so GI is not something that is causing the noise here. But my point is not to go above values of 3 on bright or dark multipliers within color mapping if you can easily avoid doing so. So getting back to my interior scene, again, I could increase the light multiplier values, but all I really need to do is tweak the color mapping because it's definitely close enough here. I always start my scenes with Reinhardt and a burn value of 0.5 because it's a nice mixture of linear and exponential. But if I stick with Reinhardt here, the only choice I have to improve the brightness in the scene is to increase the burn value, which will mean that my image applies more of a linear color mapping. And if I do that, I'm sure to see some burned out areas. If the change was very minor, if I only needed to have a little more brightness in my scene, I could probably get away with using Reinhardt and just adjusting the burn value. But it's probably a little bit too much of a change to make from the brightness that I see here to what I want. Too much of a change to make by just adjusting the burn value alone. So once I switch to exponential and set the bright and dark multipliers back to 1.0, their default values, I know my scene is going to render with a little more darker look than it previously did when I used less exponential color mapping. What I want to try here is a bright and dark multiplier value of 2.0. Basically double the apparent illumination of my scene. And I say apparent because I'm not really changing the illumination. I'm just changing essentially the exposure of my image, just like exposure control with the V-Ray camera. So with this change, my image goes from this to this. And I think the last thing that I need to do to set up the natural lighting for the scene is to add fill lights to the master suite and the dining room. I don't think I need to do anything else to the living room, so I'm going to leave it as is. And I want to switch to an exterior view now to take a look at what I'm working with for these other 2 rooms. I'm going to start with the bedroom first, and I see that there's only 3 openings total. I want to start with the opening where most sunlight comes in, most skylight comes in, which is the sliding door here, since it directly faces the sun. So I'll unhide the light for this door and turn the light on. And since the sliding door directly faces the sun, I would want to assign an intensity multiplier of at least 10.0, but because of the added effect of the light bouncing off the patio in front of the doors, I chose to bump this value up to 12.5. I have 2 windows in this room that I have to also place lights for, so I'll unhide these lights and turn them on. And now for these other two window openings in the room, they face 90 degrees away from the sun, and since they don't have the added effect of the bright concrete material bouncing light up into the openings, these two lights were given a value of 5.0. With these three lights added to the bedroom, the room goes from looking like this, which is fairly dark, to looking like this. And I think this looks good. It's a good amount of illumination for this room, but I really dislike the lack of light that's getting into the master bath. Master bath wasn't part of the scope of the project, but if it's still something that I would see from any view like this, then I would still want to consider doing something with it. And one reason why the door was open is to hide the fact that there is nothing in the master bathroom right now. But I don't like the fact that it's so dark in there, so I'll want to deal with that in just a little bit. But that's artificial lighting, and I don't want to touch the scene from an artificial standpoint. I want to get all the natural lighting correct, so I'll leave this room here as is. I'll come back to it one more time when I start adding the artificial lighting, but for right now this looks good, and I want to move on to the dining room. Now earlier I had mentioned that the sunlight and the skylight coming into the bedroom and the dining room would have a negligible effect on the illumination in the living room, because all of the light in these rooms have to pass through a small door opening, and by the time the light from these rooms reaches the living room, it's pretty weak and it's overpowered by the lighting that I've already set up in the living room. And before we get to the dining room, I just want to see this. So here's the last image of the living room that I showed without the effect of the fill lights added to the master suite. And here's the same view with the lights added to the master suite. And there's really no noticeable change to the illumination in the living room when I add these lights to the master suite. So that just goes to show you how little these scenes, these individual rooms can have on other rooms. So you really need to set up each room individually as if it's its own little scene. So at this point I want to switch back to an exterior view of this project and see what I have to work with for the dining room. And I can see that I have only two windows to deal with. There's only two windows that are casting skylight into the dining room, and they're the same size and shape, so I'm going to use two instance lights here. And again, I've already created and positioned these lights, so I'll simply unhide them and turn them on. And since they directly face the sun, and since they also have the additional light bouncing off of the patio, these lights have also been given a value of 12.5 like we saw for the master suite. And this was an easy room to illuminate, and when rendered, the room looks like this. And this is a suitable amount of natural illumination, but there is a problem. There's too much light bouncing onto the ceiling because the top of the lights are too close to the ceiling. So close that it develops a burned out area, and this is not realistic. Even though in real life there would be a little sunlight bouncing off of the outside pool deck or from the windowsill, it just couldn't possibly be this much. So I have a few choices to fix this. I don't want to reduce the light multiplier, nor do I want to adjust color mapping, because the entire scene, including this room, has good illumination. So the first thing that I might be inclined to try is to place the light outside so that the light can't hit the ceiling just above the window so strongly. So I want to do this. I want to move the light just outside, and I want to make sure it's fairly close, not too far outside. And once this light is in position, I want to render the scene again without changing anything else. And when I do, the rendering changes from this to this. So I've definitely reduced the burned out effect, but now I've got two other problems. I've got too little illumination, which isn't much of a problem. I could just simply increase the light multiplier. The light was simply reduced because it came through the window, and there's some light that's not going to reach the inside because of the tinting of the window. But the more problematic thing is I have increased noise, just like I saw when I moved the light from the living room outside. The problem with this noise is I have to increase the quality of my settings so much to fix it that I'm going to add a lot of render time. And if you experiment with this particular problem in this particular room, you'll see that you need to improve the numerous settings, not just one, numerous settings to achieve the same level of quality that you already have in other rooms without having to adjust any of these values. So you have to improve the lights shadow subdivision, but since that value is held in check by the QMC noise sampler, you got to increase the quality of the QMC noise threshold value. Improving both of these won't do any good unless you improve the GI, which won't also do you any good unless you improve the image sampling. So it's kind of a catch-22. You really have to modify more than just one setting to reduce this noise. And the more you adjust these settings, the more you're going to increase your render time. So again, if at all cost you can avoid putting the light outside, I would recommend doing that. So I don't want to put the light outside. I want to move it back inside and see if I can fix it some other way. And I want to try a couple other things to keep this light from burning out the area on the ceiling that I saw. And I can reduce the height of the light so that it's not so close to the ceiling. So I'll reduce it just a little bit. I can drop it down just a little bit. So I'll drop it down maybe a foot or a little bit more, but that's only going to help so much. The other thing that I should do in this situation is enable the ignore light normals option on the light, which makes the rays from the light more parallel as they come off the plane. And with all of these changes, I shouldn't have a burned out area on the ceiling. Now, since I reduced the area of the light by about 25%, which reduces the total illumination, and since I also reduced the illumination by another 25%, approximately 25%, by disabling the ignore light normals option, which cuts off a lot of light coming around the edges of the light. Since I cut this light down by about 25% for two different reasons, for a total of 50%, I should increase the light multiplier by about 50% to offset that, because the illumination that I had before was the proper amount. So I'll change this light multiplier value from 12.5 to 18, which is about 50% increase, and I'll see what that gives me. So the rendering changes from this to this. And this looks good, and I'm happy with this, so I'll leave this room as is. Okay, well, just like I showed with the bedroom, I want to show the effect that these lights have to the illumination in the living room. This is the image that I showed just a few moments ago, which includes the fill lights in the bedroom. And watch the area in the back by the door leading from the kitchen to the dining room. When I switch to the rendering with the dining room illuminated, notice that there's a definite change, and certainly an improvement to the look of the image, because it wouldn't look right to see this area so dark. But again, there's no noticeable change to the illumination in the living room. And so now I'm happy with this. To me, this is close enough to simulate what you would really see if you were standing in this room for real, with only the outside sunlight illuminating the interiors. Now that I have the natural lighting correct, I can work on the artificial lighting. I have a lot of different choices because this scene is going to be completely furnished, and I'll have numerous different lamps and light fixtures that I can place lights in. But I don't typically like to have lights turned on for an interior scene when the scene is so clearly illuminated with so much sunlight. So I would naturally make the decision at this point to avoid illuminating any of these rooms anymore. If this were anything but a midday sun scene, or if there were fewer window and door openings than what I have, then I would probably add some lights to different light fixtures. But as is, I don't want to do that with any of these rooms. But I do think there's plenty of opportunity to add some illumination to the kitchen. So having made the decision to add light in this area, I just have to determine what fixtures I have available. When I'm at this point in a typical project, I usually don't have all the furniture completed, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes I don't even have a furniture plan at all from the client. And I found that the furniture plan, for me anyway, is the last piece of information that the client provides, because it's the last part of a project that the client cares about and is least concerned about, at least until it's time to actually furnish a model. I didn't have a furniture plan for this project when the lighting was set up, but I knew that there would be hanging lamps somewhere over the bar area, as can be seen in this panorama image. But even knowing that, even having these light fixtures to work with, I would make the decision at this point to not use these light sources. I would always prefer to first use the ceiling fixtures that I have for two reasons. First, being up high and farther back into the areas that need the illumination, I know that these light fixtures will illuminate the kitchen far better than the hanging fixtures, the hanging lamps here. Second, I also see that the lights in the ceiling are going to be more permanent, and they're far less likely to change than the lamps or the hanging lights. So even if there are changes to the scene, even if the client wants changes to the furniture and wants to change the lights, I don't have to worry about that because these ceiling fixtures are very unlikely to change. Any changes to the client's choice of lamps or hanging fixtures can affect the illumination provided if I light the scene or light the kitchen using lights where these fixtures go. So with all that considered, I've just decided that I'm only going to light this kitchen scene, this kitchen area, using artificial light placed in the ceiling lights here. I want to start with the most simple way of adding illumination from these fixtures, and that would be to turn the light fixtures themselves into the V-Ray light material. So I'll go to the material editor, and I already have the material for the light loaded into the material editor. It's a multi-sub-object material with two sub-materials, one for the metal frame and one for the cover. And within the material assigned to the cover, all I need to do is change the material type from the V-Ray material to the V-Ray light material. And I want to start with an intensity multiplier of 1.0 and see what effect that has on my scene. So here's what the kitchen area looks like before the V-Ray light material is used, and here's what it looks like after it's used. There's a few changes to the specular highlights on the sliding door that is in the living room, and I see a tiny change to the actual light fixture itself, but there's no discernible change to the illumination in the kitchen. And that's not a big surprise to me because the size of the light cover is so small. The size of the surface area emanating light is so small. So I'm going to try increasing the intensity multiplier quite a bit to 100. So here's what the scene looks like with a value of 1.0. And when I change it to a value of 100, I see a small amount of change in a few areas, but nothing that looks at all significant or decent. Maybe the light's just way too weak, so I'll try one more change to a drastic value of 5,000 and see what that does. So here's what the scene looks like with a value of 100, and here's what it looks like with a value of 5,000. Clearly there's a dramatic effect on numerous different surfaces in the scene, but it's not the desired effect I was hoping for. The light looks very erratic. One thing you may be wondering at this point is if the poor illumination coming from the V-Ray light material is because of the low quality render settings that I'm currently using. And to see if these low settings are really the cause of the poor lighting, I want to do a test with some better settings. But before I do, I want to get a better view of the area, so I'll switch to a camera position just outside the kitchen looking up at the light fixtures. So here's the new view, and to see if the render settings are really the cause of the poor lighting, I'll make a few changes. I'll use the hold command first so that if after doing this test I want to fetch the scene the way it looks like right now, I can just return it to the settings that I have right now. So I'll use the hold command. And as far as the settings that I want to change right now, I'll change the irradiance map to a high preset, which I really don't like to do. And I'll change the hemispheric subdivisions to 50, which I like to do even less. I'll change the interpolation samples to 50. I'll change the light cast subdivision value to 1,000 actually. I'll use a very low noise threshold of 0.001. And I'll increase the image sampler settings to use a min and max value of 0 and 3, which would give me the same number of samples that the adaptive QMC sampler would give me when set to a min and max value of 1 and 8. So those are decent values. So these are all extremely high quality render settings, and even with all these changes, I can see that the change from before to after is really just not sufficient. It's definitely an improvement, and notice how nice the ceiling looks now. It's very smooth and very clean, unlike before. But this rendering is far from what I would consider acceptable. Too many spots, too much uneven lighting. So I'm going to have to abandon this method of lighting the kitchen. Notice also how ridiculously long my render time was. Even if I could get acceptable results using these settings, I would never want to endure the long render times that these settings would bring. The bottom line is you should never attempt to use the V-Ray light material for such a small surface area. For a much larger surface area, like the underside of the cabinets in this image, using the V-Ray light material would be a perfectly suitable choice because the multiplier wouldn't have to be increased so much and the light would spread out much better. The light material is also a good choice to make an object appear like it's casting light when it's really not, as in the case of the hanging lights here. And for this reason, I would still want to use the V-Ray light material in the scene. I just don't want it to have any effect on the illumination in the scene. So instead of removing it altogether, I'll simply reduce its value to 1.0. So it'll look like it's glowing, or at least on, but as I saw before, with this low intensity value, it won't have a noticeable effect on my scene. Now I just need to determine what type of light to use to simulate the light coming from these fixtures. I could use standard lights, but to prevent the light from affecting too much of my scene, I would need to enable attenuation, like I would have in real life. I don't want the illumination in the living room to be affected at all by, or at least much, by adding lights to the kitchen, because I really like the illumination that I have set up right now in the living room. So instead of using standard lights and having to deal with attenuation, I'm just going to use photometric lights, which already have attenuation built in. There's a lot of different choices for photometric lights that I can use, but I want to start with a point light, which casts light in all directions. I have a lot of different light bulbs when I use photometric lights, a lot of different light bulbs to choose from, but I don't want to use anything crazy or wild, so I'll just start with a soft white light type. I know that if I place the point light too close to any surface, I'll see a hot spot develop, and this wouldn't look good on my ceiling, so there shouldn't be any hot spot of any kind, and I want to prevent this. The light bulb in these fixtures really don't have a direct line of sight to any part of my ceiling, so I can't allow any amount of hot spot to develop because it would look unrealistic. So I need to place the light several feet below the fixtures and hope that I don't see a hot spot. And to help prevent the hot spot, I'll turn down the strength of the light by reducing the multiplier to 25% of its normal strength. And this should still provide enough illumination since I have 5 of these lights fairly close together in this kitchen. Whenever I use standard or photometric lights, I should always use V-Ray shadows. So I need to switch to V-Ray shadows now. And when I render with this light type, I see a nice amount of illumination on the wall and the painting, but unfortunately I see a hot spot on the ceiling and I just can't allow that. I already have the light a few feet below the fixture, and if I drop it any lower, I'll probably see a hot spot too low on the wall and maybe even on the countertops. So I don't think this light type will work, but just to see what the illumination will look like with all 5 ceiling lights in place, I want to instance this light to the other 4 locations. And I even want to instance this light to the fixture just outside the kitchen. There's a fixture in the dining room, and I want to use that light in the dining room to just see what effect it has in that room. So while I do this, I'll pause the video so you don't have to wait and see me place all these lights. And so now with all these lights in place, I can change one of the lights, and of course all the lights will update. I want to change to a better view of all 5 fixtures, so I'll switch to this second kitchen view, and when I render, I see a nice amount of lighting, but as I suspected, each light has an unwanted hotspot, and I just can't allow that. Well, I have the option to change to a different type of light, but I also have the option to change the light to a different type of distribution. Photometric lights have the unique setting that allows you to change how the light is distributed, and that is the distribution type. When set to isotropic, like it currently is, light is cast in all directions. I know I don't want this option, just as I saw, but I want to instead try to use one of the other 2 options, spotlight and web. If I change these lights from point to spotlight and return the multiplier value from 25% to the default 100%, this is the result I see, which really is barely any change from what I would see if I turned off these lights completely. The reason they aren't affecting the illumination in the kitchen is because of their hotspot and fall off. By default, the hotspot is set to 30 degrees and the fall off is set to 60 degrees, which means that anything outside 60 degrees won't even receive any illumination. And when the hotspot is set to only 30, even objects within the 60 degree cone won't necessarily receive much illumination. So to illuminate the kitchen more, I need to increase both the hotspot and the fall off angles. Increasing the fall off alone won't be sufficient. In fact, if I make the fall off a whopping 170 degrees and render again, I go from this to this. I see no change at all to the illumination. And I don't want to just increase the intensity multiplier because by the time I get the light to significantly illuminate the surfaces on the outer edge of the fall off cone, I'll probably have a really intense hotspot somewhere within the 30 degree hotspot cone. So after making the fall off 170 degrees, I need to increase the hotspot value, and I'll try a value of 120 to start with. And with this new hotspot value, my rendering changes from this to this, which is a significant improvement in the illumination. But the edge of the light's cone is too sharp and shows too much of a drastic change. Enabling the area shadows option won't help because the edge of the cone is not created by the shadows, but by the cone of the illumination. I could try to push the light up so that it's actually above the bottom of the frame and just below the light cover itself, and that would allow the frame to cast a shadow, which would allow me to use area shadows so that I get a softer edge. But I think all I need to do is reduce the hotspot just a little bit, reduce the hotspot angle. So I'll reduce it to an angle of 100 degrees and see what that does. And with this new angle, the rendering changes from this to this. Now, one last change I want to make. To me, it's still a little too dark, so I'll double the illumination by increasing the multiplier to 100%. And when I do, the render changes from this to this. And this looks quite nice for the spotlight distribution, so I think I'll leave it just like this. By the way, as I said, I could have pushed the light up above the bottom edge of the light frame just below the cover, but I could just as easily push the light up above the cover so that it's actually inside the light fixture, acting like a light bulb. I could do this by making the light cover not cast shadows, but if I did this, I would have to be careful that I didn't push the light up so much that it doesn't reach high enough on the wall. The reason I put the light as low as it is right now is so that it can actually reach up high on the wall. I want these lights to affect the walls almost all the way up to the ceiling. I don't want it to go all the way to the ceiling. That wouldn't be realistic. But there's really no benefit of putting the light up any farther than it is. It works fine just as it is right now. Now, this image looks pretty good, but I think I can actually improve it quite a bit by trying another distribution method I mentioned a moment ago called web. This method, the web method, looks for an IES file to dictate how it's distributed. And the biggest benefit of this method is you can really achieve some amazing distribution patterns that simply wouldn't be possible any other way, or at least easily any other way. And these patterns can really add a nice touch of realism to the illumination in the scene. And there's several places on the internet where you can go and download these file types, one of which is www.airco.com or airco.com. To download an IES file, all I need to do is select my language, choose products, select the indoor lighting, find the light type that I want, select specification sheets and planning data, and click on the exact type I want to use. When I do, I'm taken to a document with specifications for that particular type of light, and on the left-hand side of the window, I can not only download the IES file that I want to use, I can download a 3D model of that exact light type, and it comes with the frame and all the components of that light. One IES file type that I like in particular for these types of fixtures is one labeled 1589835-nice. It's one that's been passed around numerous different 3D forms. When I make the simple change of loading this file into the light, the rendering changes from this to this. And it's a drastic improvement in my opinion, and it's a look that really can't be achieved very easily with any other light type. And with this, I think I'm finished with the artificial lighting for the scene, but I want to do one more test render of each room before I switch to production render settings and before I start inserting furniture. At this point, when I render the living room, this is what I get. A fairly nice lighting setup. I want to change one last thing before calling this lighting setup complete, and that is to blur the reflections on the floor slightly. They're too strong as is, they look too much like glass, and I would have made this reflection more blurry sooner, but doing so earlier would have only increased render time. So I'll do it now, and all I need to do is drop the glossiness value down to 0.9, just enough to see good reflections, but not so much that the floor looks like it has a glass-like appearance. So when I make this change, the rendering changes from this to this. And for the dining room, with that single light that I added, which is just behind and to the right of the camera, with that extra light added, this is my final test render. And finally, the master suite with the additional light in the hallway that I mentioned earlier. So I'm finished with the lighting in this scene, and it's time to render in production mode. I want to find my production render settings before I merge the furniture, because I don't want to render with all these extra polygons in my scene. It's just going to make doing test renders take forever. I'll start with the living room and do all my testing here. Chances are whatever works for this room is also going to work fine for the other two rooms. Unlike Module 9, where I demonstrated several different production settings and all the things that you should consider, I'm going to jump straight to my typical production settings for the irradiance map and the light cache, and maybe adjust one or two things that might have a significant impact on time and quality. Within the render scene dialog box, the first thing I want to change is image sampling. And even though I would love to be able to take advantage of the adaptive subdivision sampler and render all of the large, smoothly shaded surfaces very quickly, like the walls and the roof, I know that I shouldn't use it here in this scene, because not only will I lose a lot of detail in areas like the crown molding, it doesn't handle glossy reflections very well, and since the entire floor will have glossy reflections as well as many of the different furniture pieces, I definitely don't want to use it here in this scene. So I'll switch to the adaptive QMC, increase the min and max rate to 2 and 5, change the irradiance map preset to medium, go into the light cache rollout and change subdivisions to 1000, and I'll leave it at that and see what this does for me. The area that I'm probably going to have to focus on and get most of these settings to improve best is the second floor ceiling, where light isn't as strong as it is in other parts of the scene. This is my weak link, so to speak, and if I can remove the noise here, I won't have to worry about noise anywhere else. So I could just do a test render here of this area, but since I also need to worry about the detail of my entire image, especially in the crown molding area, I'm going to render just the entire scene. When I render with these settings, my render goes from this to this. And this is a great improvement. Fairly nice quality, a lot more detail brought out, especially in the windows. Plenty of detail pretty much everywhere. There's definitely still some noise on the second floor ceiling, and as long as my GI settings are decent, I can be confident that the ceiling, which is the area that needs most improvement, can be improved with image sampling. So I'll switch to the image sampler rollout and change the color threshold to 0.005 and try again. And keep an eye on this area here. It's going to be a very subtle change, but keep an eye on the area of the ceiling here where there is some noise. And when I render with 0.005 for the color threshold, the rendering changes from this to this. and I think that is sufficient, and it didn't improve the area in the crown molding at all, but it did remove the noise in the ceiling, and I think that was a valuable change to make, so I'm going to leave it there. I still know it's possible to bring out the detail in all areas of the image, especially the crown molding, which is where I would most like to bring it out right now. It's still possible to bring out this detail, but I'm thinking I'm going to have to use too high a quality settings to do it. I'm sure that if I increase the image sampler settings, if I increase the min and max value, if I increase the radiance map resolution, maybe added some detail enhancement, which I would only do as a last resort, maybe if I increase the lightcast subdivision value, I could get all this detail to show up in the molding, but instead of enduring some really long render times, maybe 2 or 3 times the amount that I have right now, I'm just not willing to pay that price, and I want to leave it as is. There's 2 more quick changes I want to make to the scene before I call it complete. First, I want to shave a little rendering time off, hopefully without sacrificing any quality, by enabling the Use Light Cache for Glossy Rays option. Since I have a large object casting glossy reflections, i.e. the floor, I should definitely be able to reduce the render times a little bit. So once I enable this option, I'll render again. And when I do, the rendering changes from this to this. And I see really no change at all in the quality. So I want to leave this option on. I do notice that I saved about 9 minutes, or about 25% of the total rendering time. And that's definitely a nice help. That's pretty significant, and I'm definitely going to use that option. And the last thing I want to do is render the scene with a video filter. Since the final product of this project is going to be an animation, I want to see what this looks like with a video filter, which I'm almost always forced to use. Without softening up an animation using a filter like this, I run the risk of flickering and getting other artifacts. But just like most blurry effects in Max and V-Ray, the more blurred an effect is, the longer the render time. And when I render with the video filter, I should see a significant increase in render time. So here's what it looks like with no video filter, and the rendering time is 28 minutes. And here we have with the video filter, and this filter increased the rendering time about 4 minutes. Not too bad. 4 minutes I can live with, but for good measure, I would probably do a small test render of an area to see if I can get away without using the video filter. If I can, which is usually pretty rare, but if I can, then I'll use either the area filter, V-Ray length sauce, or no filter at all. So that completes Module 10 and this entire V-Ray training series. I hope these videos are a help to your work. I want to thank you for watching, and I wish you good luck.